live on Facebook. So good morning, office hours friends. My name is Chris Holmes. I am the Stembler Scholar in Residence here at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. And we are joined this morning by Dr. Brennan Breed, who is Associate Professor of Old Testament at
recently,
Theological Seminary. And Dr. Christopher Skinner, Chris Skinner, as I know him, who teaches at Loyola University in Chicago and is a New Testament professor specializing in the Gospels, but does a whole lot of other work. And we are wrapping up our study of the Gospel of Mark this morning, just covering a small section, a small and insignificant section of the Gospel of Mark, chapters 11 through 16.
Just a few hundred verses, yeah.
Just a few. So Chris and I talked last night, Brennan, and I was saying, I feel like it was easier to cover like 12 or 15 chapters of Job than it is to cover 4 chapters of the Gospel of Mark. And I think that has to do with like my mental acuity more than anything.
No, it's because most people have no idea what's in Job. Like 90% of the book, no one has any idea. So you could talk about something completely, you could just not mention half the book and no one will know the difference. Yeah. Mark, people get it. Yeah.
That's right. Well, we're looking forward to this. And Chris, we generally open our discussions, as you may know, by asking our guest hosts to reflect or share their reflections on this question about the sort of presuppositions that guide their interpretation of Scripture. What theological or cultural assumptions do you have about Scripture and about its interpretation that you might like to share? So. Thanks again for being with us.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And Brennan, congratulations. If the associate is recent, congratulations on that.
Fairly recent, thanks. Yeah, and as is the shirt, and yours too, right?
Yeah.
Come on now, buddies,
brothers, COVID brothers, right? Yeah. So I like to tell students that we don't see things as they are; we see things as we are. Right. I like to begin with that as a way of sort of, introducing my own assumptions, my own lenses. And I usually start classes, at least introductory classes for undergraduates by, saying, I have a set of lenses that you can't see, but without which I can't see. Right. And they shape, they inform, and they even taint my very best attempts at objectivity. The lenses of my upbringing, my background, my education, my race, my gender, my past, my present, my education, my role as a husband and father. I bring all of myself to the text in all its glory, but with all of its difficulties as well. So I try to use that as a way of helping students come to terms with their own lenses, so that we can put away this notion that we are going to pursue truth in an objective way, and then we can all come and sort of enter meaningfully into this conversation. So, often when I'm approaching a text, I'm thinking my goal is not to have the definitive word on a text as much as it is to enter meaningfully into a dialogue that's been taking place for millennia, right? So that's one of the first things. But against that backdrop, I would also say that, I think of myself as a scholar of Christian origins, who is also a Christian, who also has faith commitments, and that those two are not incompatible, despite what we might see in places. And in fact, very often they inform one another in meaningful ways, right? And then last thing I would say, maybe as far as my scholarship, I think of myself, or I refer to myself as a historically interested narrative critic, right? So I care about the interpretation of the Gospels especially, but the New Testament and other early Christian literature in their final forms. And yet I also think it's important that we have to situate them in their historical and social context. And, I'm constantly hammering on this with my own students, especially my PhD students, that we have to be those people who ask and answer the literary and the historical questions. They have to be wedded to one another. Yeah, so those are just a few of my assumptions. I care deeply about a lot of these issues, and I for years I taught a class on biblical hermeneutics for undergrad. So I could talk about just this one thing for probably the whole hour. So I'll go ahead and shut up. Yeah.
That's really fantastic. Thanks. Yeah, that is. It's so difficult at one point to kind of remind oneself, like when I'm reading, I know that stuff, but to keep it in the front of my mind, and when I come up with an insight or something in the text, for me to kind of step back for a second and be like, how am I in that, or how does that reflect me in some way? Yeah. It's a kind of a constant constant struggle in some ways, just to keep that in mind. But thank you so much for that. That's super helpful kind of framework for thinking about it. And maybe sometime we can have you back to just talk for the whole hour about hermeneutics, because we need to talk about that too. Yeah. But in any event, thank you so much again for coming and taking your time. I mean, to share your wisdom. Yeah. We've been looking forward to this for a while, and wrapping up, Mark, we got five big chapters. I wonder if we can kind of start by just kind of pointing out a big issue. This is my one spiel. I'm going to leave it to the New Testament scholars after this, because we got a lot to get through. But this is my thing. When I read these texts, it has also been a struggle for me as an Old Testament scholar to recognize and realize just how thoroughly shaped the text is, as an Old Testament scholar, by the context, the contemporary context, but by the political context as well, in ways that don't always show up terribly clearly. So like the prophets, think about Isaiah or something like Isaiah's speech in Isaiah chapter 9 or Isaiah chapter 11, those oracles that we love about messiahs, or an oracle about Emmanuel, the Emmanuel prophecy, and so on, these kings that are to come, that we like to quote during Advent and things, but just to see how thoroughly shaped they are by the immediate political context is really eye-opening. So like when I look at the Emmanuel prophecy, and you start with chapter 7 of Isaiah, and you got a story about these two kings that are coming to attack Jerusalem, and there's like a very specific story that's going on there. And when I look at the New Testament, one of the things about Mark that just strikes me so much is this kind of subtle background about what a king, what a lord, what a kurios, in Greek, what a lord really is. What is a leader supposed to look like? And this like kind of ironic reversals that you see, and the text almost seems kind of tricky in a way. Yeah. I'm not trying to teach who Jesus is by playing with these expectations. One of the things that surprised me when I learned kind of early on in my studies in art history was like how long it took for Christians to actually depict the crucifixion, because they were so either they were ashamed of it, or it was so powerful that it was hard for them to come to drawing it or depicting it, or they thought it might be misinterpreted or misappropriated. I mean, but so I just was, my jaw dropped. Let me share something real quick. I need some screen sharing privileges. Sorry, I forgot to ask for those before we started. But this
and they have been granted.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Yes. Okay. So this right here, this is one of the Maskell ivories. It's ivory carvings from the 5th century. So like well after the time of Constantine. This is one of the first known depictions from a Christian of the crucifixion. And you can even see that Jesus is like toughing it out on the cross, like this strong, like staring forward, kind of impassive, like not showing pain and so on. Is the first ever drawn picture of Jesus on the cross by a Christian was in the 6th century. I mean, just to say that like it took Christians centuries, even after the time that Christianity became a state religion, kind of an accepted religion, to begin depicting the crucifixion. How do we see this kind of, am I on the right track here? As an Old Testament scholar, am I sniffing up the right tree or whatever? Or do you all see more or different kinds of texture here, cultural texture, that inform basically all of Mark chapters 11 through 16, this passion narrative?
Yeah, no, that's really astute, and I appreciate the picture. I might actually steal that. I will attribute it to you, but I
well, you can attribute it to the Maskell ivory. So yeah.
Well, I will attribute my awareness of the issue to you about that. No, I especially with Mark, I do think that we are running into this very question, right? And as we talked about a little bit before we came on, we're dealing with almost all of the sort of the second half of Mark here. Generally the dividing point is somewhere in the middle of chapter 8, right around Peter's confession. And the first half of Mark is really driven by this question: who is Jesus, or who is this Jesus, or who is this man? How is he capable of doing all these things? Now, Mark tells us right away that he's the Messiah and the Son of God. We get that in verse 1 of chapter 1, right? And really, he's using the entire narrative to validate that Jesus is the Messiah and Son of God, but not in a way that is expected, right? So if I could boil down, the first half is about who is this Jesus. Really, the second half of the gospel is helping us reckon with the question, what does it mean to have a crucified Messiah and Son of God? Because that's not what we would expect from either one of those titles if we assume that, for instance, as I do, that one of them is Jewish, that is Messiah, and the other one, Son of God, is Roman, right? And I'll try to validate this later when we get to chapter 15. So yeah, I think you're absolutely on the right track there.
And so, like, when thinking about our section begins with this triumphal entry, which is sort of triumphal, but also is kind of a sad triumphal entry. At least it seems to me, right? Again, with my kind of like untrained eyes. Here's something that an art historian once showed me. This is Marcus Aurelius here, a Roman emperor who's entering into a city that he has conquered. This is kind of like a stylized image. It's not a particular story, I don't think. It's like just kind of in general what happens when a Roman emperor conquers and enters a city. You can see the people begging for his mercy, and you can see that the Roman standards are being carried into the city, and Marcus Aurelius is kind of marching triumphantly on this war horse into town. And it seems to me like, I mean, just again, my untrained eyes, that Jesus' triumphal entry is both participating in this, like the entry of a king into a city, but also is strange, right? Is he's riding in on this little colt, and the people are kind of waving palm fronds at him that they've cut in the fields, and leafy branches that they've cut actually in this, and they're spreading cloaks on the ground. It's kind of like a sad version of a triumphal entry. Is this right? Or
a sad, understated, almost villager expression of a triumphal entry.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So is it supposed to seem kind of like, I don't know, underwhelming, sad? I mean, is it supposed to, like, a Roman soldier watching this would be like, what's happening here?
Well, I think it fits with, if and I actually haven't watched the full version of the last 3 weeks, although I did catch some of what Mitzi did and some what Carolyn did a few weeks ago. So I don't know if this has been really discussed in detail, but we have this secrecy motif, so-called messianic secret or secrecy motif that runs throughout the narrative, and it's as a reminder for those who are chiming in today that it's this. We have multiple iterations of it, but when Jesus will cast out a demon, he will command the unclean spirit to silence. If they say, "I know who you are the Holy One of God," he'll say, "Silence." He'll command that people, when they see a miracle happen, or when they even see a resurrection happen, that don't tell anyone, right? And now, of course, the opposite happens, right? The opposite. The more he commands to silence, the more people proclaim, which has an ironic reversal in 16, which we can also talk about. But I think the reason for this is because for Jesus to be Messiah in the Gospel of Mark is something drastically different than what people are expecting by this, right? Yeah. But this title carries resonances that are related to things that Jesus does not, in fact, embody. So it would make sense for him to have this sort of understated triumphal entry, which might seem sad, by contrast with something Roman, when ultimately, as he's just said in 1045, that, that a part of the program here is to give his life as a ransom for many. Yeah. So in my mind, in terms of the narrative texture, it just keeps in step with this messianic secret motif and the way a messiahship has been envisioned by Mark all along. Yeah. I don't know, Chris, do you have something on that?
Yeah, I was gonna say it's almost like an ambivalent or an ambiguous like portrayal, right? That it gestures towards festival processions or royal processions. Like there's definitely those textures there. And even what the crowds say, like, again, we don't have, I always say this in my classes, we don't have transcripts or video evidence or anything that this is how it really happened. But so in the literary world of Mark's gospel, we have these crowds that are clearly saying something that is political of nature. And to say, blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. I think the evangelist Mark says, yes, there is a kingdom coming, but it's not going to look anything like the kingdom of David or anything like the kingdom of Rome. And so it's ironic or ambiguous. And in particular, Chris, I love that you pointed us back to 1045, because, when I hear this language of a ransom for many, in the context of the triumphal entry, I think about a prisoner, being, exchanged. It's a prisoner exchange. It's not a victory lap. And so it's almost as though the triumphal entry is somewhere in between what we're going to see in the crucifixion and this like grand, we just kick butt sort of triumphal entry.
I just realized, sorry, Chris, I just realized I forgot to ask you what your current research is. Let's get to that at the very end. Sorry, can we save a couple minutes at the end? I just so sorry that I forgot that. Yeah, sorry. What were you going to say, Chris?
Hey, No, I mean, and I do think, Brennan, that you're wise to point to some of the Roman stuff here. And actually, I'll just nod to one of the things. I'm actually working on Mark and Christology, and I'm working on the book on that. And what I'm trying to do is sort of break free from some of these silos that say, that Jesus should only be understood here against the backdrop of the Hebrew Bible, or only understood against the backdrop of Roman imperial propaganda. I actually, and I would show it on my wall over here, but it's a little messy. I actually have this Venn diagram that I'm using to direct my research, and I'm constantly returning back to it. And we have Jesus squarely in the middle, but we have these things that are very Hellenistic. We have these things that are very Roman, these things that are very Jewish. And those, to compartmentalize those too much is problematic because they're all sort of participating in one another. And it's hard to separate Hellenism from Judaism in the Roman world at this time, right? But I think all three of these ideological worlds are participating in what's going on here. So it's important that we do realize that there are some, as Chris pointed out, some Davidic things going on here, some things that harken back to the Hebrew Bible, but also some things that are interacting with the Roman culture, which is facing them right now.
Yeah.
Which I think comes out again in 1539 when we get to the Roman centurion, which we can talk about when we get there.
So there is a question on Facebook that I think is relevant, and it is whether or not the triumphal entry is almost a parody or a mockery of the empire. And there's a whole cottage industry, Chris, that you're well aware of empire studies in the New Testament, and it's sort of like critics of that will say people see empire everywhere, even when it's not there. And so, are we right to see a critique of empire here in chapter 11, or is it muted if it is, or do you think there's any sort of outright mockery of what Rome expects or what Rome presents itself as in terms of a rulership? Yeah.
So I'll first respond to the first thing you said, which is that all of us find what we want in the text all the time. It's not just the empire people, right? I mean,
that's right.
I do think I think it's a helpful caution. I like to tell my students that there's an interchange or an interplay between what we bring to the text and what we find in the text. And the truth is that very often what we bring to the text is as determinative in what we find, if not more so. So I appreciate you pointing to that. Yeah, I would say, and I've been one that has been a little more, I wouldn't say Heisman pose, but a little more at arm's length, keeping empire studies at arm's length as it relates to the Gospel of Mark. I do think we see it really, really strongly in places. My friend Adam Wynn has done some really good work on this, and I really like his work on this question, although I would pull back a little bit from the sort of full-throated response to what's going on in Rome. But I do think there's something to that here in this chapter. I do think that that there is a, like you say, maybe a muted mockery, if you will.
And maybe there's like an intermediate position where there's like, this is a mockery not of like Rome in particular or of Davidic theology in particular, which, I mean, it can be interpreted as that too, but like, it's about kingship. It's a which is going to involve Rome because that's the biggest kings in the world at the point, right? Or whatever, emperors, But this is it's in a way interacting with the ideology of kingship as in general. So you can talk about it in relationship to Pharaoh too, in the Old Testament, and so I'll just say I think especially if you put it in the connection with the end of the gospel too, like as you pointed out, 1539. I mean, there's something happening with authority, leadership, and expectations about that. But yeah, you can see 11 is also a mockery of the triumphal entry is a mockery of Jesus's followers too. I mean, that like this would have looked like a self mockery or like a self parody in a way. Right. I think to many.
Right, and I also think as a narrative critic, I like to think of the narrative constantly. I mean, we're always breaking things up into chunks, whether we're teaching it, whether we're preaching it, whether we're studying it. But it's always important to sort of look back at what's happened from the beginning and sort of read the entire sort of trajectory of the narrative rhetoric. And I mean, we start with 1:1. Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and not everybody agrees with me on this, but I mean, obviously Christ or Messiah is a Jewish term. It's referring to a Jewish expectation. And we know that the Caesars were referred to as the sons of God. And so I see a very distinct, one of these is Jewish, one of these is Roman. At the halfway point, we have a Jewish insider, Peter, who's proclaiming that he's the Christ. At the end, we have a Roman centurion outsider who's actually participating in the crucifixion, who proclaims that he's the Son of God. So he's he's sort of subverting both expectations, both in chapter 8, 27 to 31, and in 15:39. And I think we have to keep our eyes on that when we ask questions about whether this is mocking Rome or whether this is referring back to something Jewish or even possibly Hellenistic.
But either way, we can say that this is making a very subtle statement, and also the part of the passion narrative that is the kind of humbling of Jesus, the humiliation and the physical torture of Jesus. Like, I mean, this also is like inflected with joking about kingship. You know, the robe and the crown, and the message about that he's king of the Jews. So Jesus's lordship, or Jesus's like, what does what does a true leader look like? What does the true Messiah look like? Well, like one who has been humbled and abused and tortured, right? I mean, like and what would particularly, let's just spell it out. We kind of said this a couple of times, but like what would particularly be the problem for a Jewish audience, or perhaps even a Roman audience, for hearing this, or a Hellenistic audience for hearing this this message that the Messiah, who God has set aside, or the Son of God, right, who is to take authority over all the earth, that this person is to do that precisely through humiliation, abasement, and physical violence and death.
Right. Well, kingdoms by nature see things in terms of power dynamics, right? So, Messiah by definition kicks butt and takes names. The Son of God, Caesar, by definition is victorious, right? So it's a complete reversal of these expectations. I mean, there is not, I mean, you could probably speak to this way better, Brendan, than I could, but there's not a tradition of a suffering Messiah within Judaism. Right. I mean, even though people sort of have looked at Isaiah 53 until after the Christian era, right? There's no notion that Messiah loses any battles, right? Messiah is always the one who comes out. So yeah, I mean, I think that's what's deeply problematic, and that's why Jesus is constantly, his messiahship, not only in Mark, but also in the trajectory forward in the other Gospels, is constantly subverting these established messianic expectations.
Yeah, I mean, we could say in Isaiah too that like the suffering servant is not named as Messiah. The one named Messiah in that part of Isaiah is Cyrus, the king who kicked butt and took names. Right. So even in Isaiah, right, that there's that, like, the suffering servant did something. There was something effective about it, about the suffering. Of course, it's we have to argue about that, but yes, the victorious king still is the Messiah there, and that transforms, obviously. I mean, so that might let us see then why it took 70 some years, or I don't know, 40 years, to write, a full passion narrative, when Paul, has written about Jesus, some decades earlier, but you didn't have this entire kind of well written out passion narrative. It seems, at least for some time, so that just to give people a sense about why would Christians even be reticent to hear this, or other Jews, or sort of God-fearers, people who were interested in the Jewish God, who were not Jewish, why would they have been maybe put off by this message about a crucified Messiah? But also, why would Mark have to go to these great lengths to try to argue why this is important?
Yeah. Well, and this is where I've always found the suggestion that the Gospel of Mark and some of Paul's theology really resonate with each other. And so, what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1 about the message of the cross, which, is a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks or the Gentiles. Like, to say that you are worshiping a crucified Messiah is sort of like saying there's a three-sided square, or, I think it is at that level. We as Christians, 2,000 years later, have become so accustomed to this that I think it can take a step for us to realize how shocking and really nonsensical it would be. Like, I mean, what we're going to see in the rest of Mark, what happens to Jesus is the sort of the opposite of kingship. I mean, he is bound, he is beaten, he is defeated, he's abandoned by his followers. It's really hard to match any of that with expectations of kingship, unless you totally redefine what kingship is about.
Yeah, I used to use, so when I taught at Mount Olive College for 6 years in North Carolina before I came to Loyola, we had a great baseball team. In fact, the year before I got there, they won the Division II national championship. And I used to have a bunch of athletes and a bunch of baseball players in my class. And I would joke around. I'd come in swinging my arm, and I'd say, all right, what if I walked into the team meeting and I said, all right, the ace is here. And I said, give me some, and if you don't know baseball, this won't work. But like, what are some expectations that are associated with the word ace, right? Well, I'm probably going to to throw hard. I'm going to be intimidating. I'm going to throw fast. I'm going to blow people by. And then let's say I get up and my first pitch is a 60-mile-an-hour ball that the guy takes out. And I'm like, yes, right? And then, I proceed to give up home run after home run after home run, never really getting above 60 or 65 on the gun. You would say, well, you're not an ace. To which I would say, well, I'm just not the ace that you're expecting, right? That wouldn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, for sure.
Aces get it done.
Yeah, that's right. Aces get it done. That's a good way to put it.
So Jesus comes from this triumphal entry, comes into the city, and then immediately begins to pick fights, right? There's like this kind of controversies, right? We have the fig tree thing, which we can talk about if you want, but then the cleansing of the temple as well, where Jesus quotes the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah, both from contexts where they are attacking really the temple and its leadership for it being exclusive in the case of Isaiah, and keeping people out who God says to bring near because of their identity or their kind of how they identify themselves or how they're identified by others. But then also the quote from Jeremiah about kind of the people who are running the temple believe that God is just going to protect them because they're in the temple, even if they are acting in outrageous ways towards their neighbors, breaking all of Moses' covenants. So in any event, all to say this situation here is then followed up by Jesus getting into kind of fights with the leadership of both the temple and the Pharisees again and again. What's happening in these controversies? Why, when Jesus comes in, are there fights for ages?
Yeah, so I love the beginning of chapter 11, and I especially love, you said the first fight he picks is with this defenseless little fig tree, right? And I actually have had a ton of people ask me about this over the years. And this actually reintroduces one of Mark's favorite literary techniques, which I'm assuming you guys have talked about in a previous episode, which is intercalation or sandwiching techniques, right? He'll begin a story, he'll sandwich something in the middle, and then he'll bring that first story to completion after the second story has been completed. And we have that here. We have the temple in the middle of these two sort of visitations of the fig tree. And I think it's hard to ignore that this is some sort of enacted parable. Like he's cursing the fig tree for its literal fruitlessness, and then he's cursing the temple for its spiritual fruitlessness, if you will, or for some sort of fruitlessness, and then returning to it and then offering some sort of cryptic explanation as to why he did what he did. But then we have then he sort of is dismissing these different Jewish leaders, one after the other. What's going on there? And does this have an anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic, ring to it, especially that it's all happening in the context of the temple when there seems to be a bit of a replacement motif, if you will, like the true locus of worship will now be, through Jesus unto the Father as opposed to the temple. Lots of this stuff, which I think is deeply problematic. I like to step back from that question and point out that, well, first of all, we have in our lives, we have just as an everyday social and sociological observation, we have the most violent, the strongest disagreements with those people in our lives with whom we have the most in common. Okay, right. So I do this every semester when I'm talking about Jesus and the Jewish religious leaders. I have a twin sister, right? I love my twin sister as much as I love anybody in the world, but I have had, especially in childhood, some of the most violent interactions I've ever had with anybody with her. We just, we argued and then we loved each other. We argued and we loved each other. I tell my students, how many of you have ever gotten into an argument with your sibling? And 99.9% of the hands go up. Now, most of the people in Chicago take the L for something. I usually take the L to work in a non-COVID situation, right? And I say, how many of you have ever gotten into a knockdown, drag-out altercation with somebody on the L? And in 5 years of asking that question, I've only had one hand go up. And this apparently was a guy who had an actual fist fight with a guy on the L one night, which I don't think was his best moment. But for the most part, people say that they haven't done that. And my point is that you're not going to have really strong disagreements with people that you don't know or don't care about. You're going to have the strongest arguments with the people with whom you have the most in common. So it makes sense that Jesus would be having these internecine sort of conflicts with other Jewish leaders with whom he has disagreements, okay? That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that we do, in fact, have evidence of another distinctly Jewish group in the first century who rejected the temple under Sadducean leadership, moved out to the desert, formed its own ascetic community. If in fact the Essenes were those who were responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, they had their own writings, in fact. So I think now, have these texts been used throughout the history of interpretation to say things that are deeply anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic? Yes. And I think we have to look at reception history and some of the problematic issues there. But I don't think we need to jump immediately and say, because Jesus, who is in conflict with these Jewish leaders, is having these issues, therefore this is anti-Jewish. Jesus is Jewish. His disciples are Jewish. Most of the people in the Gospels themselves are Jewish. And so, I struggle a little bit with the question of whether or not this is fully supposed to be read in that way. I don't know. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I usually take like a similar course of action. It's saying, this is something that Luke Johnson has written about. He was obviously my advisor, but about the role of sort of polemic and rhetoric, even outside of Jewish circles, just to think of popular philosophy and how, the to an outsider, the lines that would separate like a cynic from a stoic would be minor, compared to all of the non-philosophers. Right. But you might as well think that cynics and stoics were like proposing an entirely different, some of them are flat earthers and the other group believe in science, right? Like it is, right. Like the rhetoric can be so wrapped up or ratcheted up, but they actually resemble each other a lot if you would compare them to another group that is so distinct. And so I think talking about Judaism in the first century and recognizing that these groups had a history of infighting, and we can think of our own either family dynamics or even our political dynamics, where Americans, we're living in a very divisive political moment. That goes without saying. Yeah. But nobody's saying that we wish that we could be like Australia or New Zealand. Like we're all doing it as Americans. And even where the rhetoric is so hot, we're still doing that. So I do think that's an important point. I think the subtle replacement theology that can be found in our New Testament Gospels, I think it is helpful, even if it's not Jesus's intention, to sort of bring that to the surface and say, hey, what is replacement theology? What does that mean? How has that sort of played out in Jewish and Christian interactions leading up to and following the Holocaust? And how can we read these texts differently as Christians? How can we preach these these texts differently as Christians? That's where I think it's really important, sort of to name the potential problems with the history of reception, and then carve out another way. And I think what you've done is doing that.
I just from my Old Testament perspective, I mean, perhaps I'm wrong about this, but it seems to me to really help to separate out the different factions here, that Jesus is opposed to all of them for different reasons, it seems, right? So like the Romans, I mean, are not Jesus's cup of tea probably, but the Sadducees and the temple, those folks who were aristocratic, running the temple, making a ton of money off of this, that's actually a famous Jewish pastime, is getting mad at those people, right? I mean, you look at Jesus is quoting Isaiah and Jeremiah, and Amos got mad at the temple, and the Temple of Bethel, and Micah got really mad at Jerusalem and said it was going to get plowed up because it was soaked in blood. I mean, that is to say that they're criticizing the temple and the leadership for failing to live up to the standards that God has set for it. That's fully a part of Judaism. And actually the Pharisees were mad at the Sadducees too, right? They end up kind of coming around to support this one particular thing according to the Gospels. But that Jesus' anger at the Pharisees is a bit more like your anger with your sister. That is that Jesus is similar in a lot of ways to the Pharisees in terms of like trying to liberalize the gospel in a way, or democratize it, or kind of help people follow it and so on. He's just doing it a different way. But the Sadducees seem to be the aristocratic leaders. Jesus seems to have like a different kind of righteous anger towards them, it seems to me. I don't know. But what do y'all think about that?
I haven't even, it's a great question. I haven't even really thought about it in terms of the way you just framed it. So, Chris?
Probably wrong then.
No. I mean, it's a good question. I haven't really thought about it, so I don't want to pretend that I have.
I've been hesitant to. I mean, and I don't know where we can examine this later on the analyst bench, but I've always, the more that I've been tasked at my job at first with teaching the Old Testament, the more I see Jesus's interaction with the Jewish religious leadership differently, and it's because, like what you said, the prophetic tradition is one of calling out and criticizing the leaders of the day. And some of those are kingly leaders, some of those are priestly leaders, some of those are of another sort of religious, teachers or so forth. And so I've really been struck by that lately of, wow, that frames this conversation very differently than how I might have read it in the past. The question specifically about the Sadducees, they seem, at least in my reading, and this might be more true of my reading of Matthew than of Mark, but they seem almost as non-actors, in the conversations. Jesus is real pissed off with the Pharisees and the scribes. That's clear. But the Sadducees,
I might be wrong about this, but to me, it's like in 11:18 or something, where the chief priests and the scribes, and I might be off base about this, but just kind of my halfway sociological reading for background in New Testament, and again, this is armchair stuff, but is that the chief priests, the chief priests and scribes would have been kind of in that. Like when you say Sadducee, you kind of mean like a political party almost, really, but like an aristocratic political party. But like these people would have been kind of like the symbols of that or leaders of it in some way. I might be wrong.
Yeah. So again, go ahead, Chris. You go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, I also wonder if we're dealing with the fact that most people think the gospel was written around the year 70, around the time of the destruction of the temple. We're also dealing with this group of people who are no longer sort of in power, right? And will soon no longer exist, right? Moving forward, Pharisaic Judaism will become Rabbinic Judaism, which will become normative, right? So I wonder if there's something there. Brendan, I think it's a really good question that I actually haven't thought about, and you've given me some fodder for future thought about how to understand this particular part of the narrative.
Yeah.
Well, but speaking of the narrative, we need to keep pushing on because it's 10:07 and we don't have Jesus.
Push us, Brennan. Push us.
Yeah. Yes. So chapter 13. Maybe we can spend just a minute here talking about this, because this is when we talk about early Christianity being associated with apocalypticism or an apocalyptic movement. We haven't talked about that this much. Maybe we should do like apocalypse. Maybe we should do Daniel next time or something. But in any event, early Christianity, Paul, we talk a little bit about apocalypse. This expectation that there's going to be decisive intervention by God into time and space and the earth and human society, and restructure everything in such a way that there will be a radical change in the nature of the world. We see a bit of this in chapter 13 in Mark, and Jesus even quotes Daniel or Enoch, or Daniel and Enoch together, with this idea of the Son of Man, or the mortal one, right, who's going to come out of the clouds in some kind of salvation and power and glory. But what can we say about this, or what can we even not say about this, Chris?
Yeah, I thought a lot about this. I told you guys earlier that there was back in 2005 when I just finished my comprehensive exams, and I was thinking about what I might write my dissertation on. I spent 3 weeks seriously considering writing a dissertation on Mark 13, and just gave it up because it was impossible to get your arms around anything with any. There's been very few even monographs. I can remember 2 at the time that are actually written on Mark 13. It's sort of figuring out what you think about Mark 13 is like jumping out of a bottomless pit. Not only can you not finish it, you can't start it, right? Or it feels like you can't. But a few things that I would say. So clearly we have this early Christian expectation that Jesus is going to return at any moment, right? The imminent return of Jesus. There are some who have this expectation that Jesus is going to return, and he's actually going to sort of set up shop in the temple, and the temple will be sort of the hub or the headquarters of the kingdom of God on earth. And then the kingdom of God on earth will overthrow all of the powers that have, sort of classically gone against God's people. But this seems to have definitively, this idea, been defeated once the temple gets destroyed.
Right.
And yet we still have some of the remnants of, okay, so there are, for those of you who are reading Mark's gospel in the first century and who are suffering under persecution and who are worried that he's not going to return, he is still going to return, but a whole bunch of stuff has to happen now before that takes place. And so I sort of see that happening in the background here. Otherwise, though, I just feel like it's so complex and it's really hard to get your arms around so much of it. I'd be interested to hear what sort of thoughts you guys have on either the apocalypticism or the sort of the program that's laid out for what things need to happen. I mean, there seem to be always wars and rumors of wars. There always seem, and even the whole question of the abomination that causes desolation, is this in fact a reference to something that happens with the destruction of the temple?
Yeah. So I think, what one of the places to start with this is, with apocalyptic literature generally. Apocalyptic literature is, sort of, and it isn't, we tend to associate it with end times or end of the world, but it isn't necessarily that. It's usually just language that reveals something that is hidden. And that has to do with usually God's perspective versus, a human perspective. But often we have these chronological apocalypses that, usually give us some sort of timetable. And usually the timetable is quite predictable. Things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. There will be this miraculous intervention on behalf of God and God's people, and there will be a vindication primarily of God's people. But the thing about apocalyptic literature that I find to be so fascinating is it seems to be intentionally ambiguous. I've taught Revelation at first, last fall, and the degree to which you can interpret the signs or the false messiahs or the antichrists, in any historical age is I think actually sort of part of apocalyptic language, that it's ambiguous. It might refer to this, but it might also refer to this. And so here I do think that if I'm reading Mark sometime around 70, either right before the destruction of the temple or right after the destruction of the temple, this ambiguous language certainly gives readers some frameworks for interpreting what's going around and what's going on around them without sort of giving them an A, here's A and here's B and here's C and here's how it all lines up. Like we tend to see in sort of contemporary interpretation of Revelation, right? Where it's like everything can be easily lined up. I think, so I do think that there's a framing that happens in this. And I think that Mark intended this to be useful for his first readers. But I don't necessarily know that we're ever going to get our arms around it, that image that you use. Like, are we going to know for certain everything that's going on? I don't know if we are.
Right. And I when I think about apocalyptic, and I've talked to my students a lot about this, I don't feel like we do a very good job of really teaching students how to read apocalyptic, because most of them or most just garden variety Christians who just want to read the Bible and understand it, they have Revelation, which is not a pure apocalypse. It's got some prophetic elements, it's got some narrative elements. We have some stuff in Daniel, we have Mark 13, we have Matthew 24. Other than that, we don't really have a lot of apocalyptic material, and a lot of Christians aren't reading First Enoch or Fourth Ezra or Baruch or these things that have. So like you said, there are certain things that we should come to expect, and it's always important that we understand a genre before we engage in reading that, or we're going to come away with some misunderstandings. Another thing I would say really quickly, and I'm just looking at 13 and looking at how, it's sort of, end of Jerusalem, end of the world sort of thing. I do wonder if this sort of end of the world stuff has a more local flavor to it, though, right? And I'll give you an example. So after 9/11, the country singer Alan Jackson wrote a song, and it was "Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning?" I don't know if you guys know this song. Where were you when the world stopped turning on that September day? And for those of us in the U.S. who went through 9/11 and saw so many elements of our way of life change, some of them temporarily, some of them, if you go to an airport, like I try to tell them, I have a 20-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 15-year-old. I tell them, you guys don't know what life was like in an airport pre 9/11. Things were so easy, right? For those of us who lived through that, it felt like the world stopped turning, right? But it was only for those of us in the U.S., right? And I mean, obviously other places were impacted, but not quite the same way. And so I wonder if some of this extreme language in 13 is also reflecting a very, localized sort of like we Jewish followers of Jesus who were hoping that this thing would happen hasn't happened, and it's turned our whole world upside.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a good piece too. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So again, for the sake of time, that's all that we're going to say. That's not a dissertation
we're cruising.
yet or a monograph on chapter 13, but we've said some things about 13. Let's move to the last sort of narrative section, which is Mark 14 through 16, which is really where we get the plot that's sort of working up to kill Jesus. We've seen, sort of hints at this earlier in the narrative, but this is really where the sort of the mechanics of the trial and the crucifixion sort of happen. We get maybe moving into the last 36 or 48 hours of Jesus's life. I mean, the narrative time has slowed down tremendously. Right. And so I'm wondering if you have any comments, Chris, just generally about, especially from a narrative perspective, like what's going on here as we sort of approach the beginning of 14 with this betrayal is in its works, and then by the end of 15 we've got a crucified Jesus and an empty tomb in chapter 16.
Yeah, it's so from the narrative perspective, there's this interesting sort of back and forth that seems to work its way out, consistently from 14 to 16. We have Jesus and his disciples, and we have those who are opposing him. Jesus and his disciples, those who are opposing him. There's like a constant back and forth until we reach 16. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of plotting very, very slowly, sort of all the details of what happened during this. I mean, we have, a handful of chapters that are devoted to the last week of his life, when the first, 10 or so were devoted to a couple months to a year, which actually, if we can step back, this actually matches, I mean, we see this in all four Gospels, but this also matches early Christian proclamation, right? I mean, if you look at what scholars think is the earliest proclamation of the gospel in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, Paul says that Jesus, according to the scriptures, was crucified, he died, he was buried, he was raised, he appeared, right? And those become the sort of collective verbs of early Christian experience. Right. Nobody's saying, well, what did he teach? Or where was he born? Or under what circumstances was he born, right? So, you go back to Martin Taylor's dictum in the so-called historical Jesus and the historic biblical Christ. He says that the Gospel of Mark seems to be a passion narrative with an extended introduction. And we see that here, 11 to 16, but especially in 14, when it just begins to be plotted out so laboriously every single moment, right? It isn't until later that the early church is asking these questions about where Jesus came from. And they really are concerned with all of the gory, sort of blessed details of his last, 24 to 48 hours. So.
One thing I noticed really quickly about my hypothesis is that it is in 14 the chief priests and the scribes who do all the bad stuff, and they are the ones who get Judas Iscariot and so on. The Pharisees are left out of this in Mark, which is really interesting. Of course, they're implicated in it in other Gospels, but anyway. Right. But so there's this betrayal, right? Jesus is betrayed by Judas. Jesus is then betrayed in some way by Peter, right? Jesus is betrayed by his disciples. He is abandoned and so on, left behind by everyone. That seems to me to be kind of the story of this. But then in the middle of all of that betrayal, there's the Lord's Supper where Jesus is giving. Are these two related? Has Mark created another one of these sandwiches around an actual sandwich of the Last Supper?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think they're related, right? And so let's go back to Mark chapter 3, 13 to 19. Jesus calls the 12 that he wants, and he calls them, the Greek text says, in order that they might be with him. Now, we miss this in English. So, we hear that they're going to be with him. But this is really important because they are supposed to be with him. They're going to have authority to preach and to teach and to cast out demons, right? Then in the very next chapter, Jesus, in chapter 4, tells this parable that they don't understand. And they're like, well, we don't get this, Jesus. So then he pulls them aside. He gives them an explicit interpretation of the parable. He says to them, if you don't get this one, how are you going to get all the others? And then he says this really cryptic thing that has led to a lot of ink being spilled. He says, I'm giving you guys the straight dope. Like, I'm telling you everything in plain language so that you can understand it. But to everybody on the outside, things are given in parables so that they will hear and not understand, so that they may not perceive and come to a knowledge of the truth, right? And you're like, whoa, that's not fair. But then the exact opposite thing happens throughout the gospel, right? So Jesus is continuing to be with the disciples, right? So in chapter 6, just after the feeding of the 5,000, he's walking on the water. They don't understand who he is. They think he's a ghost. In Mark chapter 8, they don't understand when Jesus is talking about the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. Later in chapter 8, Jesus is rightly called the Messiah by Peter. Yay, one strong moment. And then Peter turns right around and contradicts him, and Jesus has to call him Satan. So this betrayal, this denial, this sort of lack of understanding, this fits within the narrative trajectory of the disciples from the beginning. Like, we are expecting them, we have high hopes for them, but every time we see them talk or act or say something or do something, our estimation, their estimation sort of lowers in our eyes, because they're walking with Jesus and they don't understand. Now, by contrast, you have people like the Syrophoenician woman, who Jesus actually insults in chapter 7, and yet she ends up having like this sort of prime example of faith. So the people who are with him, the insiders, consistently get it wrong, and the people who are on the outsiders, who shouldn't get it, do. And I think that says something about the way Mark understands the Evangelion, the gospel, that it's this little tiny pebble of something that becomes invasive and pervasive and permeates the whole of those who understand, but it's completely lost on those who don't, right? So it makes sense that we would have this meal where they are with him, right? And then they would walk away and still completely fail in every way possible.
Right. And
that's my take. I don't know.
I love that. And I feel like, not just for the sake of time, but also we're just like edging to talk about it, right? We're just edging to talk about how this gospel ends. And in particular, we could have a whole other conversation about, if this is a legitimate trial, or is this an injustice, all of that. I'm not sure that those are Mark's questions necessarily, but we do get to this sort of climactic scene in chapter 15 with the death of Jesus on the cross. And perhaps one of the most surprising things, particularly from what you just said, that those on the inside seem to not get it, and those on the outside seem to really grasp it, is this declaration in 1539. A Roman centurion says, "Truly, this man was the Son of God, or God's Son." Mm-hmm. And help us understand the significance of this from a narrative or a theological perspective. Like, what the significance that this character would come to this awareness seems odd.
Yeah, so there's a lot of disagreement on this, actually. There are some people who read this as in the context of what Brennan mentioned, as sort of a Roman sneering, like, yeah, surely this guy was the Son of God, right? I actually don't agree with that. I actually think that that this is supposed to be a moment that confirms. I mean, the narrator has told us from the beginning, Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God, right? Who is in a better position to tell us, to confirm for us that Jesus is in fact the Messiah, than a Jewish insider like Peter? And who is in a better position to affirm that he is the Son of God, at least if we understand this against the backdrop of Roman imperial ideology, that he is in fact the Son of God? A Roman centurion who is supposed to be following Caesar, but sees the way Jesus dies and is amazed. I want to give a shout out to my good buddy, Kelly Iverson, who teaches at Baylor. He wrote a really compelling article on this a few years ago from a performance critical perspective. And he argues that we should understand this as an ancient applause line. That when this was being performed, this was that moment when the crowd is now participating and saying, "Oh, wow, this person who should not get it does. Wow, this is our moment for us to cheer," right? So I actually would lean more toward the latter than the former. I don't think that this is ridicule. Although I teach a class on Jesus in film, and I don't know if you know there's a Jesus film where John Wayne has one line and he plays the centurion, and it's like, "Surely this man was the Son of God," which is actually, I think, a really horrible way to voice it as well. It should have a little bit more emotion.
Be surprised.
Yeah.
And I really like that point of view, because you've already had the mocking, ironic statement in 15 verses 21 through 32. They've already mocked Jesus for being a king, but not really being a king, or, being a Messiah, but not really being a Messiah. In verse 32, "Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross." And they've already mocked the guy a lot.
Yeah.
And like, you're going to have one guy make one little tiny extra joke at the end. It's like the guy who says the joke 5 minutes later. It's like, we already did that. We've already run the bit out, you know?
Yeah.
So the only way that surely this man is the Son of God, like, you're right. Like, it narratively, it's a little afterthought unless it is that applause line of
if I can borrow Johannine terminology, this is a revelatory moment. Right. This is the moment that's a revelation, not just for the centurion, but also for the audience who's participating. Yeah. Because we talk about like an omniscient narrator, like the narrator knows everything and dispenses it as he or she wishes. But the audience is informed, but not omniscient. So the audience knows that Jesus is the Messiah and Son of God because we've been told that at the beginning. But now we have to see that validated by the way Mark puts the story together. And this moment for us is like, yes, right? This is putting the second piece of that Messiah and Son of God thing together for us.
Yeah. And when I've taught this at the seminary level, I always, I'm of the same sort of persuasion as you, that this is climactic and theologically significant, not just a jeering or, an ironic or mocking statement. And I think that the challenge of the claim, the early Christian claim that this crucified Messiah has now come to share in the life and reign of God is that we can tell the story about Jesus and know where it's going. This is the first human voice to acknowledge that Jesus is the Son of God. It's the only one in the Gospel of Mark that's a human voice. And we've heard demons say it. We've heard the voice from on high say it. And it is not insignificant that the human gets it when Jesus is on the cross. And I think that is just so compelling and challenging and all of that. So thank you. So
can I say one real quick thing with just one thing that stood out to me right now is just thinking about like we're talking about the inversion of the notion of a king and of a Messiah and so on. And it just struck me that like the cry of dereliction in 1534, where Jesus mixes Hebrew and Aramaic to say Eloi, Eloi, lama, which is good Hebrew, and then sabachthani, which is Aramaic. My God, why have you forsaken me? People say Jesus. Yeah, people say Jesus spoke Aramaic, but he spoke Hebrew Aramaic. A little bit like Spanglish. It's kind of mixture, right? But so when Jesus says that, also like he's not living up to a lot of people's expectations of what a true spiritual hero would be too. That is to say, like impassive and I don't ever complain or things like that. He's doing what a lamenter would do in that situation. Anyway, just to say like this kind of full, I don't know, there's something a bit canonic about that for me. Jesus is every expectation of somebody being like superhuman or something like that, or
he just continues to subvert those expectations to the moment of his death. Right?
Well, even the language, thinking about a good death, like Socrates, like, poisons himself to die, like, and there's no like, and then he was vomiting and then he, he asked, I really regret doing this. And this was a bad decision. It's, this is again, another like super weak moment from all of the cultural stereotypes. And it's just, we have become so accustomed to it that it's good to point it out.
And can I just say, like, kind of framing this and moving that to our final discussion of the resurrection. We get the notice of the women at the cross, the only ones to not have fully abandoned Jesus. But we have Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, perhaps Mary, Jesus's mother, but we don't know. It's not exactly spelled out. And then Salome, and then of course there's the burial, the taking care of Jesus's body, and the participation.
And notice there's no disciples, right? The disciples are not exonerated. They're not. They're never rehabilitated. Yeah.
Right. So and then we have the resurrection, which is the women, and we end. The kind of the initial version of the book of Mark ends at verse 8. And just to spell this out, that verses 9 all the way through the end of the chapter 20 are additions that later Christians added to this text. And we can
pastiche actually of later gospel materials. I mean, you can trace like 3/4 of it to other gospel traditions. So So on that real quick, I just want to say I am of the opinion, as I think the majority, that Mark did originally end at 16:8, right? And of course, early Christians found this to be unacceptable because of that last phrase. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. I just want to point out two things really quickly about this because I know we're running short on time. The first is, this is a complete reversal of the secrecy motif throughout the gospel. Jesus does something miraculous, And then he says, do not tell anybody. And the more he says that, the more they tell. Now Jesus does the most miraculous thing, right? He overcomes death. And then the angels or the young men sitting on the right side, they say, hey, go out and proclaim that he has done X, Y, Z. And they say nothing to anyone. So it's this ironic reversal of what's happened throughout the gospel, like irrespective of when Jesus said, don't tell, people have proclaimed, right? Mm-hmm. The other point I want to make is that this is an ironic ending, and it does take some nuance and it does take some work to get there, but you have to stop and ask, well, wait a minute. Surely they told someone, because how do we now know this story of them not telling anybody, right? And it's a subtle, I think it's a subtle reminder to those who have undergone Roman persecution, who've seen the temple get destroyed. Listen, overcome your fear and follow Jesus in the same way these women overcame their fear and followed Jesus and proclaimed him. It takes a little bit of thinking to get there, but I think that's probably what's intended by this. And
how do I know this unless, right?
But early Christians didn't love that, so they added all these, extra endings.
Yeah, because they were afraid. They were also told not to be afraid. But I mean, the beginning of an oracle of salvation is "do not be afraid," and the angel says that in verse 6. But then they are afraid. That is, that they haven't yet built up the courage. And then like the story kind of ends abruptly. But it seems to me like I've always read this and thought like then it's kind of thrown back on the reader. Like it's a bit of like an existential. Like, and Mark has done this elsewhere in the gospel. Where Mark it's almost like the person writing the book like looks at you, the reader, and says something, right? It's almost like, and then they didn't say anything because they were afraid. How about you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I think that's what's happening.
Like the ball's in your court now. Yeah. And
again, just and lots has been written on this. Again, the cultural expectations. There's been a lot that has been written about the fact that women are the first evangelists, right? And just how, from a cultural expectation in the first century world, already we're opening ourselves as Christians to all sorts of questions because about the reliability of women as witnesses and misogynistic stereotypes of women. And again, Mark doesn't seem to get away from the fact that the earliest, the first witnesses to the empty tomb, the witnesses to the cross are women. And
the only ones that don't abandon him, in fact.
Right, exactly. And even says in 1541 that there were all of these other women that used to care for Jesus as well. Again, very subtle, but the ways in which it is subverting a cultural narrative of reliable witnesses and, all of this, that no, actually these are, because we're hearing this, as you said, Chris, because we've heard this story, we know that they did tell someone, and just how subversive this.
So they become our models. They've overcome their fear,
right?
And they've proclaimed. Now it's our goal to follow their model. Right.
Yeah. And those disciples who were with Jesus the whole time. Yeah. I love that it doesn't end with them. It ends with the people who were considered ancillary to those disciples, right? The ones who were actually outside the system of power. Those are the ones that actually end up with the message that's been entrusted to them. And they're the ones that kickstart the whole thing.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys know the cartoonist Naked Pastor. Have you seen this?
I don't think so. Yeah.
Yeah, he does. You should look him up. He does a lot of really subversive stuff himself. And he has one where he has a group of disciples who are talking to the group of women, and it says, ladies, you've done something to the effect of, ladies, you've done a wonderful job proclaiming the message. We'll take it from here. Right. And it's supposed to be, sort of a comment on how, the authority has been stolen from women really throughout the history of Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not a great way to end our conversation, but it will be an end to our conversation. Yeah. We can invite others to tell the story and be as subversive as well. A bit
like Mark, we end abruptly.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But Chris, thank you again.
My pleasure. I appreciate y'all having me.
Not only did you talk about 11 through 16, but you also got some chapter 1 in there and some chapter 3 in there and 4 and 8. So it's been a rich conversation for us. Brennan, thank you for keeping us honest with your questions about Hebrew and Aramaic. That was great. So just before we leave, just a quick plug for what we're doing next. We're doing an Advent study on Mary, the mother of Jesus. We've got 4 weeks of that coming up. So no break, no rest for the weary. We're just charging right in to Advent. And we will be joined next week by Reverend Dr. Susan Hyland, who teaches at Candler School of Theology. And she's going to be talking about Mary in the New Testament. Yes, Susan is another specialist in the Gospel of John, like Chris Skinner. So don't want to miss it. And yeah, it's going to be great.
Chris, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for sharing your wisdom. And what I really appreciate about you too is the way you're able to do synthetic work, tying together all the themes of the Gospel of Mark and finding these. That was so helpful. And I honestly come away from this hour seeing the Gospel in an entirely different way than I had before. So thanks so much.
Fantastic. I really appreciate you guys having me.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. All right, y'all. See ya.
Thanks, y'all.